Hello, everyone, and welcome to Just DAO It, the podcast for people starting DAOs. I'm Adam Miller, and I'm your host. Prior to starting my DAO, I did consulting for people starting and operating DAOs. And now at my DAO, we do legal entities for DAOs and Web3 projects. As always, we're recording live, so apologies in advance for any technical difficulties. We have guest Bryan Petes. I know him as BPetes. Welcome to the show, Bryan.
Hey, thanks, Adam. Thanks for having me on. This is going to be fun.
Yeah, you got it. So, as the audience knows, we always do the show in two parts. The first part is going to be the Just DAO It news report, where we will go through recent DAO news headlines and tweets and casts, and you and I will respond to the story. So I'll summarize them for us both and for the audience, and we'll respond to them. So what's our hot take? Do we agree or disagree with the author? What does it say about DAOs, the future of DAOs, starting DAOs, etc.? And then in the second half of the show, we'll go into our in-depth interview with you, BPetes. But before we start the news report, still would love a brief intro. So could you tell us a little bit about yourself and what makes you an authority on DAOs?
Yeah, brief is not my forte, so we'll see if we can pull this off. But so yeah, I have always been interested in technology and how it helps people since a young age. Didn't really know how to put it in those terms. It took me through to engineering at one point in time. So I was a mechanical engineer for a little while, working on passenger rail equipment, trying to help cities procure new light rail or commuter rail equipment. And it was not the place of innovation. My engineering education in the academic environment and out there in the rail industry, it was kind of like participating in the tail end of the Industrial Revolution and truly feeling its end in many ways. And that really led me to sort of calibrate with what am I up to? Why am I, doing what I'm doing instead of, punching this ticket at the engineering school and then going and working in this field. And it really woke me up, especially when this young fellow came to work with us, and he had been building model railroad trains his entire life. He loved going to the rail side and seeing just, the trains moving. And when I saw that passion, I knew that I hadn't found my passion in the rail industry. And so this is what led me to high tech. And so I started to be very curious about innovation and creation. And I noticed that in the rail industry, not only was it an old technology, there were just tons of resistance to innovation in North America. The Code of Federal Regulations, the airline lobby, there was just a lot stacked against it. When I saw what Silicon Valley was doing in terms of their playbook for innovation, I was enamored and drank the Kool-Aid. But as I started to work in a smart city scale up, we were growing rapidly, and I was noticing that we lost that. It started to feel very much like the places I was previously in the rail industry. And this is when I started to have this light bulb moment of how we're organizing is what's killing the innovation, because I was having these experiences that I was having in these large, passenger rail or government organization procurement programs that I used to be involved in, but I was starting to smell them in the early stage startup as it transitioned into bringing in the managerial hierarchy. And this is what got me thinking about, humans and how we organize and how we collaborate and innovation and progression and impact and connecting the two together. I was fascinated by this, rotated through a ton of different roles, often was pushed into project management, product management, executive leadership positions. And as I was pushed into them, I also saw the dysfunction of my relationship to my peers. We used to work alongside one another and build amazing stuff. And all of a sudden, they were asking me to make decisions, and the decision making was centralized into me, but they had all the context. So I'd ask them, what was going on, what their opinions were, and then I'd have to be the ultimate decider. And it really felt quite dysfunctional. And so as I got more involved as well in, considering entrepreneurship myself, I started to see the dysfunctions of the capital market, even in these innovative Silicon Valley venture funded setups, and the ways in which we coordinated there seemed, like something was off. And so I was looking for something different. And as I was looking for something different in 2017, I stumbled into, the Ethereum.org website, and I saw these ideas around smart contracts for DAOs. And I had also recently read Reinventing Organizations by Frederick Laloux, which was taking a look at like self-organizing teams and holacracies and sociocracies and how they were actually applied out there. And there was this is the moment that I've been on ever since, is DAOs, and using this this trustless smart contract to organize, help people organize at scale. I could see, sort of the intersection of what was happening in these self-organizing organic movements that Frederick Laloux was talking about in Reinventing Organizations, and what was happening as people were working on these blockchain technologies and imagining what was possible, and calling that a decentralized autonomous organization. And I just haven't stopped thinking about it over the last 6 years. So what makes me an authority is that for 6 years, I've just been obsessed and immersed. I love immersing myself in a community. So first immersing, when the infra was being laid by Consensys as a part of the Consensys organization in 2017, 2018, as they were kind of proto-DAOing it. In the 2021 phase, immersing myself in BanklessDAO, CityDAO as a founding citizen, Polygon DAO as they were bringing up their grants program, and just many others along the way. I guess you're saying, why are you an authority? Because I played alongside those as they were experimenting for years now, and have been having a lot of fun doing it.
Wow. Oh man, that makes me want to do the interview now, because there's so much stuff I want to ask you about, but we're going to follow the usual format, and we're going to go do the news first, but encourage people to stick around for at least 30-40 minutes until we get through the news to hear more about BPetes' background in the space. A lot of interesting stuff we could dig into there, and a lot of stuff you haven't even mentioned yet, like what you're working on now. So we will get to that soon. But first, the Just DAO It news report. So again, I will summarize each of these stories for the audience and for the guest, and then we will share our reactions. So the first story of the week, this is from the Royal Gazette, which is a Bermuda newspaper. And the headline is, BDA Legal Committee establishes new DAO. The Bermuda Business Development Agency has established a working group to investigate law reform proposals for the introduction of digital governance models. So this is great in two ways, I would say. One is that Bermuda is looking at updating their laws to reflect and respect DAOs, which obviously is the line of work that I'm in. Most of our listeners know, and you know, which is writing laws for DAOs and Web3. And they're actually doing it through a DAO, which is the second time I've seen this. They're starting a DAO, which is, I think, it's the working group. I would love to know, like, what is different about this working group from their other working groups, such that they're calling it a DAO, or is it just a DAO in name only, and it's really just a working group? And that was not something I was able to find out. But I think it's the second or third time I've heard of a country. I think Japan might have done this too, where they said we're starting a DAO to look into DAOs. I think even the United Nations might have done this. So anyways, exciting to see. I must admit, I've seen probably 10 or 15 countries now launch working groups to look at DAO specific legislation, and very few have come out on the other side taking any action, but I certainly hope Bermuda will be different here. What do you think, BPetes?
Well, I think they've got the right approach. I hadn't heard about this being the second time, so this is news to me, of taking the approach of being a DAO to investigate DAOs, and I think it's the only way. I think that they've got the right idea there, and even if they're DAO in name only, as many of the DAOs were that I experienced in the 2021 cycle, that in itself is its own learning. So, as I said in my intro, immersion is the way to learn, and so I think they've got the right idea there. And even if it's not successful immediately from this working group and the subsequent work, the individuals who have participated will carry that on. And I think that's the most important aspect of it for Bermuda,
sure.
And for the space.
Yeah, and if you're curious, I just Googled it, and I know we talked about this at the time on the show, but in December of 2023, so about 6-7 months ago, the United Nations Internet Governance Forum said it formed a group to initiate a DAO. So I guess that's one step before. They didn't say we created a DAO. They said we created something to create a DAO, but still nice to see governments and international governing bodies experimenting with DAOs. The next story of the week. This one is from zkSync. Sorry, well, the article is from the block, and I also have the tweet or post up here on X from ZK Nation. The headline is zkSync introduces a decentralized governance framework called ZK Nation. zkSync has introduced a new community-driven governance framework. It consists of 3 on-chain bodies: the Token Assembly, the Security Council, and the Guardians. And then there's also a linked post on X from the ZK Nation, which appears to be the main X account for zkSync, at least for one of the zkSync organizations. And there's a whole announcement that goes into the details on their new governance body. Basically, zkSync is DAOifying, right? They're saying, hey, instead of us being in charge, we're giving control to this new decentralized, and maybe it's fair to call it a framework, because really they have multiple organizations in the traditional sense of the word. They have these 3 different bodies, which apparently, according to the article, also have their own legal forms. So each has its own legal entity and legal form, and they all interact collectively to govern the zkSync protocol. So, let me see, BPetes first. Anything you want to dig into here?
I think this is exciting. I hadn't heard of this news, but I had heard that the ZK drop had a large proportion of tokens going to the community, and I think that in itself was already a really strong signal. Following it up with this is really powerful when coupled to that, I think. And there's some things about this that remind me of when Optimism was pushing their 2-house model and trying to innovate on how we approach DAO governance. And I think that's done a lot of good for us as a group to sort of see something different. And so if zkSync is now doing a multi-party sort of setup, has dropped a lot of tokens to community and continues to plan to do so, that allows for them to have the right incentives to do the tough work, to work on the DAO, its operations and its governance, and not just kind of plow forward and say, oh, we're a DAO. Like they're willing to work on the DAO, and they're putting the correct incentives to do it. And so that's exciting. I'm curious to see where this goes.
Yeah, and one of the things I have to dig into here, there's just part of me that reacts to having really, there's almost 2 bodies here with veto power. There's the Guardians, who seem to have overall veto power to keep things aligned with the quote unquote values of the project. And there's also a Security Council that has the ability to freeze the chain if there's a security threat. And at least part of me wants to say, man, I mean, one of the cool things about DAOs is that you can be completely democratic if you want to. You don't have to have a Security Council. You don't have to have Guardians. You don't have to have a board. You don't have to have a CEO, stuff like that. But I think increasingly, but even since the beginning of DAOs, you do have DAOs that have these small groups, I think it's fair to say centralized groups, that have some kind of veto power. And I'm not necessarily against it. I just think it's interesting to note that, even with the option of going total democracy, a lot of organizations are choosing something kind of in between. And I wonder if is that just a temporary Band-Aid until DAOs figure out how to do direct democracy better? Are we always going to have centralized groups in decentralized ecosystems? What do you think?
Yeah, so I love this. And I think at the end of the day, that's why I'm just celebrating experiments and not necessarily infusing my own opinion. And I think it's because it's such a complex domain that we kind of need to be playing with both, and I remember, from a lot of the DAOs that I was participating in the last cycle, there was this dialogue around, how aggressively you decentralize versus whether you centralize things into committees, grants committees, these types of centralized authorities that may or may not last forever, that are there to kind of like protect, guardians. security, etc. These are worthy reasons to perhaps in an early phase of experimentation centralize power. But I do agree with you that like this should be something that we're continuing to push towards more decentralization when we can have the confidence and comfort to do so. And unfortunately, it takes people to experiment and risk capture, because at the other end of the spectrum is we push decentralization, we don't have the right mechanisms, tokenomics, et cetera, in place, and then something beautiful that we wish lasted actually gets captured. And so I see this trade-off, and I don't think that there's a perfect answer. And so I'm just enthusiastic about people trying something. And I hope that because there's a lot of folks who, you know, are token holders, and hopefully that the token distribution is strongly decentralized, that could at least produce the correct pushback. If centralization of power is not actually serving the community, then social pressure is just as powerful, I think. And we would hope that that's what drives, I guess, the transition to something more decentralized over time, if even though maybe it's starting the way it is. So.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it reminds me even of what's happening in Purple DAO right now, which I think we're both in, right? Are you in Purple? So
Yeah.
for anyone who doesn't know, although I've probably talked about it a lot, but Purple is a noun-ish DAO that drives growth of the Farcaster ecosystem unofficially, not an official Farcaster. It's not officially the Farcaster DAO, but in some ways it is unofficially. And we've always actually had a veto power vested in one person. And actually, so now what we're talking about doing, there's a proposal live to decentralize that a bit more and elect a security council. And so actually moving in the direction of more decentralization. But in that scenario, I don't know, it's never really bothered me that we have someone with a veto power. You know, their job is to make sure that we generally stay on mission. And I guess it's a function that holds, in some ways, like helps hold the DAO together, at least from a, like, I don't know. I mean, I'm thinking if a third of the people wanted to go work on a different mission, they can't, right? They're going to get vetoed, even if they tried to vote in a different direction. We also saw what happens with Noun's DAO, which maybe to your point shows the power of social pressure, because when enough of the people who had the actual NFT wanted to fork and take their money elsewhere, eventually even the security council or veto person gave in and said, okay, we'll have to just allow you to do it. So anyways, interesting to note.
Yeah. And I think that's when we play with those mechanisms of like a decentralized smart contract of governance having control over centralizing power, then that to me, those are more experiments that I want to see. I want to see, and I'm wearing my Hats hat, and I'm a member of the Hats ProtoDAO, and I like the idea of being able to play with having very decentralized group being able to make those big shifts, but moving power functionally into roles that people play. And security council is a role, and if the community is struggling with how that role is being fulfilled, that they have the opportunity to do something, whether it's exit, fork, or change who's wearing the hat. There's something about that power living with the decentralized community that's important.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So reflecting back on ZK Nation, you know, if this security council is elected democratically, that would make me feel, I think, much better in my gut about the direction this DAO is going, versus if it's put into place by the founders and can only elect itself, then I would feel like maybe that's a little bit of a step back in terms of true decentralization.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting because when I think of an L2 and I'm like thinking on the spot, but I feel like I should give this more consideration, that when it comes to things like L2 beat, taking a look at the sort of health of an L2, that your ability to exit safely, and to move your liquidity and to sell your token on the open market, like in many ways, these are the things that protect you as a token holder or a participant in the ecosystem. And I think some of the things that can be concerning is, as an L2 is maturing, if the exits aren't as clean and permissionless, then these types of centralization vectors have a lot more power that they're holding. And so the other thing that can happen is changing the amount of power they're holding is another way to deal with progressively decentralizing this, so to speak.
Yeah, well, what I'm hearing from you too is that just having a way out is a form of decentralized power. And so even if, I mean, I'm even imagining it, let's say we started DAO today for some purpose and power is actually highly concentrated in the hands of a few, but anyone can rage quit or sell easily anytime. Maybe that's just more decentralized than a traditional organization where they have the same centralized power structure, but they also hold a lot more power over you as an individual and what you get or don't get if you leave.
Yeah. And I think this is like the interesting thing is it takes some real rigor to take a look at the full complicated and complex system that exists. And this is why it all feels like an experiment, because it's like we'll find the things that didn't work according to design, and some of the failures would be catastrophic and have been right from the very first one, the DAO and the DAO. And so I think we learn from these, and as someone who's in early, I like to expect them, and encourage others to expect them.
Yep, love it. All right, turning to the next story of the week. This one is a post on X from Vitalik, and I'll just read part of it. Vitalik says, "I am feeling quite unhappy about this cycle's celebrity experimentation so far." Talking about celebrity meme coins that have been coming out, including Mother, which what is Mother? Do you know? Is that about the political thing?
No, it's I can't remember the famous star who's driving it, and this is how little interest. It's like it goes in one and out the other. It's like, so basically, famous star created token, Mother's the token, and there is. Yeah, what I'm getting from Vitalik and his commentary was that like the celebrities do this. Jenner did one recently. Previous cycles there's been these types of celebrity tokens. I think Paris Hilton got in trouble with the SEC for one, if I recall, or someone, maybe one of the Kardashians did. So, they just use their clout, pump token, and it's basically a meme token with a celebrity backing it, and adding the firepower of their existing community, which is that's a shortcut to starting a meme token, really, at the end of the day. And so, where I listen to Vitalik's commentary on this and fully agree with it is sort of the relatively lame versions of it we're seeing this cycle. And so I think Vitalik was close to Amila Kunitz-Action-Kusher when they did Stoner Cats NFT in the last cycle. And I am a original minter and holder of the Stoner Cats NFT. And so I loved what was happening there. I saw celebrities coming in and trying to do an animated series where you got an insider's view. They had to deal with the SEC. They were hoping to not, create it such that we co-owned the creation, because they were trying to avoid running afoul with the SEC. The SEC ended up ironically shutting them down anyways on the project, but they were trying to create utility for fans to get an insider experience. Their token would unlock the ability to watch the shows as they were coming off the press. You could meet the animators and have town halls with them. I thought that was really innovative. They're using their star power. And their domain of making shows and movies and their connections into the Hollywood engine. And they were combining that and opening it up to fans. And they had governance to vote on fan participation and submissions to the show as it was being written. Like, if you could just give some equity to the fans, that would have been a really, really complete project in terms of fans crowdfunding, lifting up and having return in it. And instead, the SEC shuts it down. And we get Mother, where maybe they're saying you can buy some merch with your Mother token. Well, I think that is pretty lame, and I agree with Vitalik. I'm sorry for the rant, but I was so
no, I love it. It's perfect.
Stoner Cats.
Yeah, well, and one of the things Vitalik says in the next post in the thread, which is why I put this in the DAO news report, is one of Vitalik's ideas was like, at least do a DAO, like at least give some kind of governance rights to these token holders so they can decide something together. And I love that, because actually I think that's it. I think virtually any, like, in my vision of the future, not even that far distant future, literally everything has a DAO associated with it. I don't know if we'll call it a DAO, but like when you buy like Oreo cookies, you're going to get some Oreo tokens with them. Like it's like practically inevitable to me. And those tokens are, they may be maybe there's an NFT element, maybe there's art, right? Maybe there's a collectible element, maybe there's rewards, a utility. You're also going to get to like join the thing, like whatever it is. And that's pretty much going to be the DAO. You join the DAO, and then there's going to be a chat room. There's going to be stuff you can vote on. Maybe you get to pick the next like color for like whatever Oreos. And I just think everything is going to work that way. Products, communities, geographies. And I think the reason for that is like, it's not that hard, especially once you're already giving out a token. It's pretty much a DAO already. Like the question is just, are you the project creator going to create the chat room, the token gating, the governance mechanism, or is someone from the community going to do it for you? And I think as a founder, that should make you seriously consider, okay, on one hand, yes, it's cool that in crypto we have the ability to have these like open ecosystems where anyone can do anything. So that's powerful. And you could argue that's what happened with like DGen on Farcaster, right? Because Farcaster didn't launch a token, the community did it, and it seems to have worked pretty well. But I would think if I was a Farcaster founder, and for a year, everyone, including me, was like, when token. And they were just like, oh, what's the point? There's no need for a token. Maybe they're regretting that now. Either way, I think clearly like this, it's this little like add-on component you can put onto almost any token, any project, any product, any ecosystem is like the DAO component. And I think it's a miss. I would agree. It's a miss not to do that for any of these celebrity coins too.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's the ultimate fan experience or community experience is participation, and that's just what a DAO is. Right. And all it is it's tokenized so that it's digital and it's on this open and composable thing. And I think that's really important because that open composable, like sure, I could create Oreo token and have Oreo app, and that's really just points on my back end of my Oreo app. And we could vote on the next, seasonal Oreo design or something along those lines. But what's cooler is when, if you think of the Oreo is actually a part of a larger, sort of food portfolio. A consumer goods portfolio, and if I'm able to have tokens across multiple goods and cross-pollinate them out there in various loyalty rewards, participation programs, or vampire attacking, I realize that they don't want to open themselves up to that, but frankly, that's the future. And there's so many benefits to being open that it's worth also facing. And not to mention the drama and news that you can get from brand when vampire attacks occurring. Uniswap's just fine, even though SushiSwap went at it. And so I think as brands wake up to this, it's all going to be tokens. It's all going to be DAOs, and it's the most intimate experience ever for people.
Yep. By the way, I think Mother is Iggy Azalea based on a little bit of searching through X. and I'd be surprised if she doesn't get in trouble, because there's posts of her just like with the hashtag Mother, and then it's just like a video of her, and it's like, don't you have to have some disclaimers or something when you do something like that? So
I imagine it'll just take time.
yeah, probably. No, I do think there isn't this interesting like trend in crypto that I think these celeb coins are part of, which is this idea that, a true meme coin might be the safest way to avoid the SEC calling your thing a security, because the more you literally say there is no reason to give, this thing has no value, do not buy it, no value, there's no benefits, there's no community, there's no DAO, there's no nothing, don't buy it. Now maybe you're actually safer in terms of the SEC because you're not telling people to make an investment. You're not giving them a reason it'll go up. You're not doing anything that people can rely on for the success of the investment. You're telling them you're not doing anything. So I think it's still kind of interesting that maybe it's an area for experimentation, extra experimentation in crypto, just because it's the farthest thing from what the SEC might want to go after. So maybe there's a good reason why we have lots of meme coins today.
I really like that exercise, and I think that you're onto something there. And in many ways, that's really, really sad too, because then the introduction is exactly what Vitalik was sort of lamenting. The very first experience for some of these new retail consumer participants is going to be getting rugged in a meme token game, and also having the experience afterwards of, that's a really lame game to play. I didn't enjoy that game. We can play so much richer games with one another using these technologies. But yeah, I think that in many ways, you know, tinfoil hat on, maybe that's exactly what a repressive regime that's wanting to shut down or cool or chill crypto wants. They want nothing but trash to be able to point at. Look at this garbage. And the safest thing for you to do from a legal standpoint is to do the garbage thing. Like that's really sad.
It is. Yeah. Like, just gamble. Don't do any of the real value generating stuff.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And then we can say that it's nothing but a degenerate gambling environment that hurts retail that may be coming in slightly naive. Excellent. All the talking points are there.
Yeah. Damn. Good point. All right. So it's still important to be building real things. Everybody take note. Not just meme coins. All right. So the next article of the week. This one is from theconversation.com, which is not a crypto. It's like a deep, looks like philosophical journal. And the headline is, "Why the future of democracy could depend on your group chats. Is your social media group a budding democracy or someone's fiefdom?" All right, so this is an article by the author of a book called Governable Spaces, which I highly recommend people check out. I read about the first half and I was like, all right, I get it. It's enough. But definitely a good book. The author's name is Nathan Schneider. And the article and the book are about this idea that what made democracy so successful in America so far, especially the first couple hundred years, as observed actually by Alexis de Tocqueville when he toured the United States in the early 1830s, was that all over America we have democracy, little democracies. Every organization we're part of tends to evolve or devolve or whatever, turn into a democracy of some kind. Every club in every high school, every club that families are part of. What are the examples that Tocqueville gives? He doesn't. It doesn't say in the article, and I don't recall, but he says that he sees all over the place. Oh, organizations like garden clubs in communities are like little schools for practicing the general theory of association. As members of small democracies, people were learning to be citizens of a democratic country. And interestingly, if you look at our online spaces today, before crypto at least, they don't tend to operate that way. Look at Reddit communities. Look at any kind, literally every blog, every comment section of every website. Either a big company is in charge and gets to decide what you can say and can't say and how you use the space, or a moderator is in charge. And I guess maybe sometimes there's 2 or 3 moderators. For example, I haven't been huge into Reddit, although I certainly look at it a lot. But the idea is maybe what we need is to turn these online spaces into things that are more like little democracies, so that people can once again practice and experience democracy in our entire life, from the time we start using cell phones as, I don't know, 13-year-olds plus or minus. We need to be experiencing democracy so that we get how it works and we see how it connects from even the smallest organization in a country all the way up to our national and international governments. So this book, actually, having read it, I wish he talked more about DAOs, because to me, it was like, oh, wow, he's describing like exactly what we're doing and building in the DAO space. He talks a little bit about them, but certainly I think aligned in values that we need to make our technology in general and the spaces that we spend time in more democratic and less authoritarian.
Wow, I hadn't read this book. It's been coming up a lot in conversations, over on Farcaster. And so when I start to hear something multiple times, I know I have to go and pay more attention to it.
Yep.
So thank you.
You're welcome.
In terms of what this is sensing into, it's funny, I was listening to this and thinking of my own experiences growing up, and I too was participating in not-for-profits and clubs, and I was often on the participant member side, and inevitably often was curious and attracted to volunteering for positions in the board, often as a member representative of an orchestra I played in, or helping as a part of coaches association or something along those lines, in a sport that I was playing. And what this immediately did in my sort of early youth was it brought me to Robert's rules of a meeting and how you are democratically approving what we are doing as a board, and how we run a meeting. I mean, obviously there's some weird dysfunctions to these old antiquated ways of doing things, but it was exposure to democracy like you're describing, and you're so right. In sort of the way that we have experienced our digital lives with more authoritarian setups. And I believe if you have that sort of mimetic desires, then that becomes comfortable, that becomes known, and you also start to have these desires to be the mod, not be somebody who's being a steward for the community and collecting the voice of the community and trying to vote on behalf of the community. And so there are some interesting sort of things that are likely happening behaviorally just by not being exposed. And so, yeah, I never really thought of DAOs from that perspective. And like when we were talking about Oreo points and tokens and voting on Oreo stuff, like it's giving us that practice. It's helping build muscle, and it's creating a desire and a default that perhaps is a really valuable one to have that is being eroded. And I had never really thought about it from that angle.
Yeah, super interesting. I mean, I always took part in student councils, at least as long as I had them, from middle school, high school, and college. And I know it's not something everyone's into, but I wonder how many people involved in the DAO industry may have a history of student councils, nonprofit boards, other forms of, like, I don't want to call nonprofits practice, but maybe all the school stuff is practice and real. It'd be interesting to see how much overlap there is between people working in this space and people who have participated in governance throughout their lives.
Yeah, and maybe it was in video games in terms of guild governance. In a World of Warcraft guild, maybe it was like myself, a model UN debate club, fan or something along those lines. And good
point. Oh, that makes me wonder too, like if my whatever video games I play, if the clans I'm in were forced to be more democratic, would people like that, or would that just turn them off and would they say, I don't want to have to vote? I don't know. I could see it going both ways, maybe depending on the scenario. I mean, certainly when things go wrong, that's when you wish there was a democracy, right? Like when the clan leader goes crazy or disappears or makes some decision everyone hates.
Yeah, or when the the video game developer themselves ends up nerfing something on you, and which I believe is why Vitalik was drawn towards creating Ethereum in the first place. And so I think these are the types of things where honestly simplistic games like meme tokens, or more authoritative models and participating them in the form of play, great. Like finite games can be a lot of fun. And they're sort of good exercise for the mind and experiences. But when the stakes start to get higher, when something really matters to you, and losing it all in an authoritative regime. If you've had that experience once in your life, even if it was as silly as a character that you invested in a video game and it brought you to tears when it was nerfed, like you start to have empathy for, hey, when something starts to matter to me and to others, perhaps this model is not the best model.
Yeah, interesting. All right, we're going to fast forward to the last article of the week, and there may be a couple in the show notes that we don't cover, and then we'll turn to the interview. The last post of the week actually is from the DAO's channel on Farcaster, where BPetes and I both like to spend some time. And the post is from Coulter, and it's actually a post of their blog post. The headline is incorporating a DAO contradicting its purpose? And the headline of the article, which is on udhc.com, is there is no DAO. Okay, so this article starts by digging into the nuance of the terminology of the phrase DAO, and that there's a lot of disagreement over what the terms mean. Now, interestingly to me, actually, this article focuses on the word autonomous as being where the confusion comes from. But I think there's just as much confusion from each of the words decentralized and autonomous. This author points out, is it about the organization being autonomous of any of other entity or individual, for example, or is it about running autonomously on the blockchain such that when decisions are made, they are implemented autonomously? And I think actually the same debate happens over the term decentralized. Does it apply to the people involved in the organization, and is the way they govern themselves or the way they operate socially and politically decentralized? Or does it refer to the technology that the DAO runs on, being on decentralized technology? And maybe it doesn't matter if you want to have a centralized team, you're still running on decentralized technology. So both terms in decentralized autonomous organization. But actually, I think what the rest of the article goes on to talk about is some confusion without naming it around the term organization. This article goes on to say, do DAOs really exist? Because according to the author, the nature of DAOs is that they're fluid. People come and go. They don't rely on any one person. And as a result, and even if you try to, let's say you, for a second, you assume the word organization means something, like one thing. Does that being one thing actually make you not decentralized and not autonomous? And this is a part I want to try to, I guess this is pretty philosophical, but I want to take issue with this last point because this does come up, I think, a lot in conversations I have with people about DAOs, because it goes from, okay, is being one thing, does that already make us not really a DAO? And therefore, does incorporating, right, by forming a legal entity, does that make us not really a DAO? Because now we're acknowledging that we are one thing. And one thing, necessarily when you draw a thing on a piece of paper, it's going to be, maybe it's in the center, or it's going to look like it's in the center because it's the one thing on the page. And so that scares people away from, hey, well, if there's a center, is it not decentralized? I think, to me, there is something necessarily centralizing about an organization, right? The word organization means there is something cohesive, something consistent, something collective about whatever it is that you're talking about. And maybe that's the mission. Maybe it's the budget. Maybe it's the vision. It's the product, right? Every organization is different, but I think usually by the time you're calling yourself an organization, the reason is that you are trying to coalesce around something. And you can do that in a very decentralized way or not a decentralized way. You can do it in a more autonomous or not autonomous way. But I don't think that just by virtue of being a thing, that necessarily makes you not decentralized, or certainly that you can't exist at all. Any thoughts on this one, BPetes?
Yeah, I feel like sometimes when it comes to the term DAO and dissecting decentralized, autonomous, and organization, honestly, it starts to feel a little bit like a religion and fundamentalism for me sometimes, where it's sort of like, oh, you're not truly a DAO, or you're not truly decentralized, or you're not truly autonomous if you don't have autonomy from X. And I feel as though this kind of reminds me of another movement in the way in which people worked, which was the agile movement. And so they had this manifesto, and the manifesto was beautiful because it was basically saying, we want more of this and less of that, and more of this and less of that. And that will be a more, wonderful way and productive way to code software. And so when you come along to DAOs, I feel as though it's instructive and helpful to think we favor decentralization as much as possible over centralization. We favor enhancing autonomy of the organization and autonomy of the individual as much as possible when building. And we recognize we are an organization. And so and like you said, that creates friction right away if you're trying to be a fundamentalist in terms of autonomy or decentralization.
Yeah.
And I think if you think of it more philosophically, like you prompted at the beginning, this might get philosophical. Well, think of it more philosophically, and see it as an experimental space, and see it as nested groups. It's because we know as in DAOs, we talk about sub DAOs and guilds and project teams and committees and working groups, etc. These are all nested within this other thing that we were calling the DAO, which are all nested within the Ethereum ecosystem of DAOs, which are all nested in the global ecosystem of organizations, state nations, etc. that are, I think the DAO movement is asking, try to become more decentralized and give more autonomy as you organize on a global scale. And so if you zoom in and start to attack a particular cell and not see the whole as attempting to become more decentralized with this movement, and that it is a philosophy and a movement, then forest trees, you're missing it, in my opinion.
Yeah. Well, I love that. I mean, and just to take your metaphor regarding agile a little bit farther, you probably end up with a lot of arguments over, is this agile or is it not, right? But then someone coming at it from your perspective would say, look, it doesn't matter. Is it more agile than, right?
Yeah.
Are we using agile as the North Star to make
Yes.
decisions, right? And
Yeah.
then it doesn't have to be agile or not. It's just, are we following these principles in ways that are useful?
Yeah, I really struggle with frameworks like scrum.org, which are effectively there to tell you that there's only one way to do it and sell you consulting hours, versus the manifesto is instructive. Every time we're having a discussion as a team trying to be more agile, ask, is this what the manifesto was calling us to be and do? And then have a debate.
Yep.
And try and experiment.
Yep. Awesome. All right. Well, that does it for the Just DAO It news report. We will do a quick segue here, including an ad for MyDAO, the sponsor of the show, and then we'll turn to our in-depth interview with BPetes. So for the ad, just a reminder to everyone listening that MyDAO, my company, provides legal entity solutions for DAOs based out of the Marshall Islands. We also have a network of crypto and Web3 and DAO lawyers, tax advisors, other professionals all over the world that we're happy to get you connected with at no charge. Or if you are a lawyer or another professional advisor and would like to be added to our network, please reach out about finding more business also at no cost through MyDAO and about our legal entity options. So with that out of the way, let's turn to the featured guest interview with BPetes. So you already told us, Bryan, a little bit earlier on about how you got into Web3. I just want to recap it and see if I got this about right before we turn to other questions. So you were working, I believe, in the railroad business, which turned out to be a little bit too low tech for you. And then you were in smart cities, where you realized, in conjunction with your experience in railroads, that there were problems with bureaucracy and how things were governed. And so it sounded like to me, you put those two things together, high tech and new forms of governance, and ended up finding crypto and DAOs. Is that about how you got into Web3 in the first place, or did I miss anything?
No, that's the basic gist of it. Yep.
Okay, awesome. So let's dig into what you're working on right now, because I think there's at least three things we can talk about. I think we can talk about at least Hats, Sobol, and Tipster. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah, those would be the fun ones.
Okay, so where should we start? Maybe which one was first in your life?
Yeah, Sobel was. So
Okay,
Sobel started when I joined the Consensys Mesh in 2017. It
and
wasn't Sobel
what is that?
at
What
that
is the
point.
consensus mesh?
Yeah. So back in 2017, during the ICO boom, Consensys, uh, with Joe Lubin's leadership and capital, was trying to figure out how to build all of the apps and infra that Ethereum and the Ethereum virtual machine was promising. And so it's the home that incubated MetaMask, Infura, Gitcoin, and many others. And in many ways, because Joe is one of the founders of Ethereum, was very close to the idea of decentralization in organizing and in how capital moves and decisions around capital, not just the technology layer. And so Consensys at that phase was experimenting with what now we have come to call proto-DAOs. There was what they called the hub and spoke model. And so they had hub services and venture spokes that were all being incubated, and a large global remote first talent pool that was effectively capable of moving across all of these things. And so there were like, marketing services and design services and design thinking groups. And then there were ventures called the spokes. And so the ventures had to make decisions regarding capital and runway. And, initially Joe was making those decisions, but the power moved into the mesh itself. We would do what was called a resource allocation committee. And it was kind of like doing jury duty to decisions around how capital would flow into the various spokes and hub services on a periodic basis. And so you would rotate in and act as a subject matter expert. So I participated sometimes as a product and go-to-market specialist, and then would be there to provide feedback to pitches, and asks for funding, which is a lot like what DAOs do in terms of grants and grant funding and grant committees setups. And so that's what they did, but they had to do it socially because they were actually building the infra that is being used by DAOs in the next cycle in 2021. And so it was all a little too early. There were identity plays like Uport. There were MetaMask, and then there was Gnosis was in the ecosystem as well of Consensys. And so, you get multi-sigs later and how powerful they are for DAOs. But that wasn't there at that point in time. So Sobol was myself and my fellow co-founders embedded in that mesh and trying to understand how we can help solve some of the coordination problems and challenges that were there. And the very first one that we were given, and we were actually given two when we sort of researched and wanted to support this group and build something. And one was the information is all over the place. And so I can't find what I'm looking for, which would be like it's in Notion somewhere or in G Drive somewhere kind of thing.
Yep.
And it was rapidly evolving. And then the other was everything is changing so rapidly around here because people are moving in and out of different teams or participating in roles on multiple ventures, or new ventures are being created, or spokes are shutting down, and then dispersing people back into the broader mesh to find other spots to participate and contribute. And that dynamic nature at a certain scale was causing a lot of challenge and friction. And we got tasked, by the mesh to go and take a look at that. Can we visualize that? Can we stay on top of that? And how might we do so? And that's what Sobol was born to do. We were born to visualize decentralized autonomous organizations, and as they rapidly evolve, be able to create a clear picture. Because one of the things that we missed, that was there for us in traditional organizations is the org chart. The org chart is a wayfinding mechanism. It's an imperfect one because it's not actually how work gets done in the organization, as per our conversation of agile previously. But the org chart did help us navigate, particularly as you're rapidly growing. You've got new people coming in, and in DAOs, we describe this now as the onboarding problem. And so Sobol really wanted to make it easy to see what's going on in the DAO and try to find a spot to participate that was, bringing you at the intersection of your passions and skills and the emerging business needs. So we'd model roles, people and their profiles, teams, and we would model goals and relationships between goals and people and roles and that are activating them. And we would model agreements as well, was one of the objects that came up as we continued investigating this with Consensys. And so teams would form agreements with one another to work together, be it a services agreement, with the marketing department to do a rebranding of one of the spokes. And so these types of agreements and making them explicit and transparent, you start to get a really interesting networked graph of how the organization is changing shape and the ability to navigate. And so that's what Sobol was. And we've been on that for 6 years. We revamped it, connected it to Discord roles via Discord bot in 2021, and started working with DAOs and had hundreds of monthly active DAOs, thousands of DAOs using Sobol to map their organizations and connected into some of the tools that they were using, like Discord or Collabland. We were a partner in their marketplace launch as well. And so Sobol was all about visualizing that coordination graph.
Interesting. Okay, so I was familiar with Sobol through BanklessDAO as a way of very literally visualizing like the org structure. So there were like circles. Maybe one was a marketing guild, one was a treasury guild, one was a grants committee, and I could see which ones I was in and which ones other people were in. But it sounds like you guys have gone a little beyond just that. If you're integrating things like Discord roles and agreements between groups or between members, I mean, how do you think about how far does Sobol go? By the way, it's sobol.io if folks are looking to check it out. How far does that go in terms of just wanting to be a visualization layer versus also getting involved in the structure of the organization? Like, is Sobol where these agreements are formed between groups, or just visualized?
Yeah, so Sobol's philosophy, and in many ways it was way too early, but that's kind of half the fun sometimes as a founder. And so Sobol's thought was that, because it comes from sort of that 2017, 2018 era, where there was something back then called the FAT protocol thesis, and the idea that a lot was going to be happening at the protocol layer. It was going to be open and composable, and tokenized and visible on chain, etc. And so we were like, wow, organizations are going to get completely on chain, and there's going to be a need for clients. And so we wanted to build the first client. And our hope was that our back end would be completely eaten by the protocol layer. And then we were waiting and waiting and waiting and had way too much, living in this Neo4j graph data model, on an Amazon back end. And we just kept waiting and waiting and waiting. And, we watched the identity space, and we would take a look at decentralized identity and the way in which it was going to create an open protocol of relationships between things via verifiable credentials. We watched as we waited for more things to go on chain, like governance, except it wasn't. And so we were going to have to use APIs to integrate to things like Snapshot, etc. And so that was rather frustrating to not see that protocol gap closing as fast as we'd hoped, which is part of the reason why I think the other thing that we were mentioning, and this is a good point to bring it up, is HatsProtocol. HatsProtocol was the first protocol that was structural in nature and on-chain. And so we saw HatsProtocol as taking a lot of the roles that were in Discord role tags and other Web2 apps, and were in these sort of sequestered, centralized backends, and bringing them into an on-chain primitive that could be composed into governance and other smart contract-based automation to automate the evolution of structure and bring it on chain. And I was like, wow, that's amazing. The first time I read the paper that Spencer and the team were putting forward over there. And that was the protocol we were waiting for. We wanted to be an ideal partner. And so Sobol's next chapter, after the 2021 chapter of trying to integrate to Discord, collab land, Gnosis Safe, and then explored integrations to identity solutions and snapshot, and it's just like wasn't quite working. We went over and we built a Hats client. So we created a Hats client that was a code composer where you could compose your Hats tree. You could compose it with things like Gnosis Safe or Moloch's governance. You could click a deploy button and do an automated deploy sequence, and you could actually interact with that using an LLM. So we were playing with that as well, and so we love this idea that there can be a many client world over top of these protocols. And I think this is something that now the industry is really starting to marinate into because of Farcaster. And so we start to see how Farcaster as a protocol can produce lots of social clients, or Lens as a protocol can produce lots of different Lens and Lenster style clients. And we can see this now more visibly, and that was the vision of Sobol. It's like that's going to happen as well for DAO tooling, but it kind of didn't last cycle, and so I'd really like to see it in this cycle.
So I know we still want to talk about Tipster too, but let's dig into the DAO tooling space for a minute, because it's interesting to hear about your disappointment in the progression of protocols over the course of at least a few years leading up to a couple of years ago. And I would say I've maybe had a similar experience over the past 3 years since I got into DAOs for the first time, where, initially when I got into DAOs, what was really exciting was all the DAO tooling. It's like we were going from a world where you had maybe one or two like DAO tooling platforms, maybe like Moloch and DAO Stack, fairly technical still. Most people still, if you were launching a DAO, you'd probably be writing your own code, to a world where you had like 10 or 15 DAO tooling platforms, where you could go and just through a web interface, configure your DAO's parameters, hit a button to launch about all the smart contracts. And then that tool would help you manage the DAO, visualize the DAO, stuff like that. And initially, when I left my corporate job just under 3 years ago, I got into the DAO tooling space. I was going to build new DAO tools until I came across the opportunity to run my DAO instead, it was total surprise. I mean, I'm not a lawyer. I'm a tech entrepreneur. I ended up now running this legal related business. And I think over the past couple of years, I kind of felt like, okay, like that's fine that I'm working on the legal side. It's a good opportunity. There's a real need here. But I'm glad to know that lots of people are working on the tooling side, because we still need to see a lot of progress there. And now fast forward a few years, it's not clear to me if we've made enough, at least a lot of progress on the DAO tooling side, at least when it comes to like the basic, like configure how you want your governance to work, what kind of token you want to use, how you're going to distribute it, and then like do the votes, the proposals and the votes. I feel like I haven't seen a lot of progress. If anything, like half of the tools have disappeared or stagnated, and the other half maybe are relatively stagnant. And then I don't know, maybe there's just like a few. And now Hats has been the one of the few, and then also some progress at Aragon and DAO House. I'm curious, so if you agree with my assessment, that there just hasn't been a lot of progress over the like I feel like we're still far from mainstream in terms of being ready for mainstream. Like if I was going to go to my friend who I've been talking about DAOs with for the past 2 years, and he says, so how has it gone? Like, is it time for me to start a DAO for my local like church group or not? I probably say maybe not, and I'd feel really bad about that because I wanted to be ready for that by now.
Yeah, and I think it's getting ready, and I think there were a lot of people and teams who tried really hard to build, and I think what really comes down to is like if you look at Ethereum and its evolution, and the infrastructure, the amount, because I said it as my beginning of my story was actually amongst those who were working really hard together to try and bring up some of the key infrastructure that we now take for granted, and that is flourishing, and it actually even has diversity now in terms of choice. Whereas, and that took multiple cycles. I feel like because of the DAO hack, we kind of lost a cycle on DAOs in some ways. And thanks to groups like those who summoned Moloch, they got us over our DAO PTSD, and we started to have something invigorated last cycle. And so I feel like last cycle was us testing the gaps in the infrastructure layer and noticing how much we were relying on kludging Web 2 solutions or building what I call Web 2.5 DAO tooling applications. As a DAO tooling creator, we created a Web 2.5, not a full bore, Web 3 application. And, as I was calling out, and that happened to many. And then, the cycles do the cycles thing. And unfortunately, it dumps some really good ideas and some really good teams, because you have funding come in, you try something, and if you caught the wrong timing, it recycles back out. That intelligence recycles back out, but the team and what they were attempting to do too early was not conserved. I'm really grateful that Hats caught the right timing to push through, and there are many that have continued to build through, as you highlighted yourself. And I think there was also another key missing ingredient. DAOs are social, and the social layer was entirely Web 2. It had a no construct of
like
Web3
Discord, Telegram, stuff like that.
Exactly. Discourse, the place where we do governance, even, which was a little more purpose built for the pre-governance process, social in nature, fully Web 2. Open source software, which is probably why Discourse was chosen. You can host, etc. It's got good properties for a decentralized community use, but it has very little knowledge of all the other stuff that's going on adjacent to it that's in the on-chain world. Not to mention the fact that L2s as well were not full-fledged as DAOs started up in the last cycle.
Right.
So we had to find ways around that too. And so Snapshot, I mentioned it earlier. I don't mention it disparagingly. I mention it as a gift. In the same way that Polygon in the early days as a sidechain and Gnosis Chain as a sidechain were helping. They were a gift of scaling. XDAI was a gift of scaling before scaling had arrived. And so DAOs also really needed that kind of scaling on chain to be able to do something like Hats. It would be ridiculous to try and track all your roles and have smart contract based automation around your DAO structure without that more performant execution layer. And so there's a lot of things that I think are brewing in this cycle that bring me optimism. One is Lens, Farcaster have had an opportunity to do a cycle and mature. And in the case of Farcaster, have some daily active user breakout recently as well. And also the L2s have really hit stride. And Ethereum L1 has been doing a lot to improve scaling. You gotta think the merge happened last cycle. DAOs were trying to do stuff pre-merge,
Yeah.
And so if you really steep in this history of it, I have a lot of empathy for how we built and why we built the way we did. And I have a lot of appreciation for groups that tried to glue it all together. Collabland, Guild XYZ, trying to make sure that our social space was connected to our wallets and our on-chain, identities. And so I think there's something magical that can happen this cycle, and that's why we were building tipster.bot that you mentioned earlier. I think Farcasters and Farcaster channels, that protocol, and some of the clients that are now being built upon it that are creating an invitation to communities to come and have an open social graph layer that's about how we socialize and follow one another, that is connected to the token layer through the wallets, and their verified wallets and ENS that are connected. And we're starting to see this bigger picture, plus the power of cost efficient L2s. We're starting to see that the right firepower is there now to go at DAOs again. And similar to the way in which Moloch had to get us over our PTSD of the DAO hack, with all of the simplicity and precautions that the Moloch contract had put in place to try and give us a chance to play with investment DAOs, very simplified DAOs to spark the last one. I really am excited to see how tipping games on these social substrates maybe get us over sort of that trough of disillusionment that we came into as DAOs started being called DAOs in name only, and treasuries got attacked and communities folded, and the last cycle had its experiments and had its failures. And I think that a new wave of tooling is right to be built. alongside those who have kept building and found ways to keep building. And I think new communities are forming and they're taking the classic pattern that they always took. It was tweets that sparked DAOs, and now it is posts and casts in a decentralized social environment, which more rapidly can transition into DAO experiments. And we're already starting to see them over there on Farcaster. We're already starting to see DAO signals through these tipping games. That's an early DAO emissions game that's right up there with the types of things we saw last cycle with Coordinate, and frankly, Collabland tips and tipping bots were a big thing then too. And so we're redoing it, but on the right substrates this time. And I think, and a Web3 centric tech stack. And I think that's a really, really discounted unlock. And I think that's going to be the seeds of the new wave.
Yeah. So just talk a little bit more about tipster.bot, and it's at tipster.bot. I've used it. I think I was one of the first users. We're using it in the DAO's channel on Farcaster, where anyone who's been active there has a allowance. So every day they can tip up to 1,000 quote unquote DAOs with the $sign. And there's no promise. It's a pure experiment, right? There's no promise as to what these points might one day mean. But the assumption is that it'll be a signal that's used one day, if and when, and I think the assumption is always when, even if it's a long time from now, we end up needing to put some kind of structured governance in place, because things start to get we start to achieve scale, and it's too hard to just run things manually, or this is not values aligned. So, we're starting to signal this point system. Anyways, just tell us a little more about Tipster. What's the overall pitch? How should people think about it, and when they might want to use it for their own communities?
Yeah, so tipster.bot is inspired by what was happening with DGen, Hire, and many of the other tokens that were being token tipping games that were occurring on Farcaster. So communities would form, and then they would start to show that they appreciated the value others were contributing. So in the case of DGen, your content on Farcaster. I will tip you DGen for great content. And it was set up so that those who had been there and embodied the vibe of Farcaster, aka the OG accounts, were given tipping allowance. And so you have this immediately decentralized emissions of a proto token, because it wasn't even on chain. It's like points in the same way, but unlike points, it wasn't a centralized authority like a DeFi protocol deciding who gets points and why. It was the community from day zero being able to decide. The community that was already there, the OG posters who knew good content when they saw it and wanted to tip others and encourage others to grow the community. And so that's what tokens are really good at. In this case, it's proto token. And then this produces the opportunity for progressive airdrops of the actual tokens. And eventually, DGen becomes an L3 on base and a token and a whole token ecosystem, and has inspired lots of others to go and do this. And so tipster.bot comes from that inspiration and says it's more fun when you democratize this beyond just those who can develop code and build their own bot and solution. And because that is a barrier to entry. So tipster.bot just means that any community can come together on Farcaster and play a tipping game to bootstrap their community and signal what they're finding value, and give tipping allowance to those who have already provided value, and thus start to create a reputational marker which could be used in future on-chain games, be it dropping a token and establishing governance. And I think where I want to see this go, and why tipster.bot and these DGen tipping games were so interesting to me, is that governable spaces thing that we discussed earlier. We're playing with it, as you mentioned, in the DAO's channel over on Farcaster, and it's because we're creating a space that may need communal governance in the future. But right now it doesn't, but we need to prepare to know who was here, who helped make this space what it is. And through a tipping game, we can start to have signal along the way of what was valued as we as a community grow. And that gives the opportunity, as the affordances come on, to further decentralize the governance of a space like this and connect it to Web3 assets, not unlike the recent Farcaster channels protocolization and decentralization. They've been adding in the ability to have curation. AutoMod has been building bots that allow you to create moderation rule sets, and those can be driven by token rules. And so you can start to connect the dots to see that there's an opportunity for through something like tipster.bot and tips saying who should be governing. And then there's the opportunity for the space itself and the value it provides of like curating which posts should show or be pushed to the top of the fold is a power that is key in governing that space, and that today is somewhat centralized, often on Farcaster spaces to those who were the channel creators, aka the Reddit mod thing. So this kind of like ties all the things we've been discussing today together, I think. And so I'm excited about tipster.bot as the front edge, and these tipping games as the front edge of preparing for governable spaces.
Interesting. Yeah. What about in terms of what you're seeing in this space? So we've mentioned some tools you're working on that are really exciting, including Sobol, Tipster. We mentioned Snapshot. I mentioned DAO House, which is just the front end for Moloch, which you mentioned a couple of times. Are there other tools that are exciting right now to you because you see either they've come a long way or they're new and exciting, or just that you know that there are a lot of good people working on, or just enough good people working on the tool, and therefore you're excited to see what they might come out with in the near future?
Yeah, so I've become nounish curious, and I've seen some interesting experiments over the years in nouns. It's on chain, and some of the most recent noun experiments that I found fascinating, or nounish experiments, are verbs and grounds.DAO, and it's because they're mixing an ERC20 token with the nouns NFT governance model, allowing for a little more granularity. And so I'm curious sort of about that experiment. And I think I'm also really interested in Charmverse. I think Charmverse has been trying to find ways to have Web3 at the core as they're building knowledge-based management and what I call pre-governance. That space where you make decisions socially before you move into on-chain voting and an on-chain signature of one's comment regarding one's vote. And so I think having those kinds of off-chain spaces, they're fascinating to me. And I think Farcaster itself as a protocol, so not Warpcast the client, but Farcaster the protocol, is massively fascinating to me because, as I mentioned earlier, one of the biggest friction points of the previous cycle was just how much is living in sort of Web 2 backends. And what I think Farcaster protocol has done is they created a clever way to have signed off-chain data, aka your messages, your likes, etc., and that you're signing those, and they're cryptographically verifiable, but they're not on-chain. And I find that really fascinating because it then does have a relationship to your on-chain identity, the Farcaster ID, and your on-chain addresses that you've run a signed signing ceremony of signing, hey, I own this address and I'm associating it to this. And so that is something that I was hoping for last cycle, was to see more protocols that are graphs in nature, that show the relationships between things and bridge the off-chain to the on-chain world, and allow for richer, very Web3 clients to emerge. And so I think my greatest fascination right now is what social graph protocols, signed off-chain data solutions, and their bridging to on-chain worlds are possible in this cycle, and what relationship will those have to decentralized autonomous organizations, because they are, as I mentioned with my experiences in Sobol, just a graph of relationships between people and their marketplace interactions as they do work together in that marketplace of work. And so that's where I'm seeing things going, and I'm excited to participate building into.
Yeah. Is there anything else you'd want to share about your vision for the future of DAOs? So if you look forward, maybe a whole cycle, let's say either we're at the beginning of the bull, but it's got another year or two left, or maybe we never even hit the bull market and the next one's not coming for a few years. Either way, what's your vision for where DAOs are going to be in 1, 2, 3 years, assuming we do have another bull run in crypto?
Yeah. So last cycle, DAOs showed that they are a reasonable way to invest safely. So they created investment DAOs. Investment DAOs worked last cycle, in my opinion, and they continue to work. And so I feel as though the innovation this cycle is going to be social DAOs that actually work. And so I think that we will have social DAOs where we will be doing mostly social things, like the fans voting on X and feeling like they're participating in the story, and us progressing towards these governable spaces. This is so clearly, I need to get this book because it's so clearly in the zeitgeist right now. And that I think is what's happening right now. And I think that this is the, if I keep zooming out into the future, I think these are the seeds on which we will have all the key connections, be it protocols and new clients emerging that are entwined so richly with the social protocols and the social attributes of things, that we will end up in the following cycle finally capable of doing the types of organizations we've been dreaming of doing from the beginning. The replacing what happens at the club and not, cooperative, not-for-profit, corporate, enterprise venturing. Like, you can see that higher stake, higher value, higher problematic domain, if captured, is possible. And I think there's one piece that I know you're working on, which is that sure, it's important to have these off-chain social things become more cryptographically verifiable and connected to the on-chain world, but these two worlds also need to become more connected to the real world. And doing the work that you're doing and thinking about how we enmesh in a meaningful and productive way the traditional state, nation, and legal systems, while they are the sort of backbone of how we operate, and enmeshing them in a meaningful and productive ways into this emerging social and on-chain domain. That triad feels so necessary to pull off that thing in the following cycles and subsequent cycles that I'm envisioning, which is, these highly productive, full-scale, like enterprise level, venture happening productively and efficiently on chain and as a DAO. And that, you can see that at that point in time, if you keep zooming out, I get excited about a global talent marketplace. Part of what brought me to this space that I haven't sort of described is that I love moving around. I have that, I guess later in life, I've come to understand in a self-diagnosed way that I have ADHD, and I like to move around, and it's a superpower for me to be in multiple spaces at once, and then having that percolate in my being, and then applying it in those multiple spaces, and feeding into myself and feeding it back out, and that is where I thrive. And I imagine what DAOs are setting up when they get to that sort of like, level that we're describing here, that you end up with a global talent marketplace, on the perfect rails for running a marketplace, as shown by DeFi already. And that this fully digital, high liquidity talent marketplace will be available, and through remote work, which has already happened in the previous cycle, we will be able to plug into that. And as individuals, that could be a really fulfilling way to participate in the world. And that ideally, if we also solve some of the centralization problems surrounding AI and the data sovereignty issues, which I think crypto is working on too, we could start to actually work in fun ways at a DAO level scale where the relationship that honestly I have sometimes with the AI that I'm working with in my workflow is bloody fun, and it doesn't feel threatening. It feels exciting as a creator.
Mm-hmm.
But if we can harness this in ways that don't erode our our ability to participate as humans in a way that preserves our sovereignty, we could start to bring AI into DAOs in ways that I can't even dream of yet. But they would be great at doing certain jobs that we often today centralize into committees, like we were discussing earlier, like the security committee, etc., and or coordination prompts, to us as humans to participate in spots that match our skills and passions. Auto GPT plays DAO, for example. Like, I think that there's an opportunity for there to be a really fun collaboration between human agents and AI agents to build things that we haven't even dreamed of, and I think that's where things are headed if we do this right. And I think there's a lot of things that could go wrong along the way, and I hope that we learn those lessons quickly and don't paint ourselves into a corner where we can't get out from it in a timely manner.
It's, by the way, another way the word autonomous might apply to DAOs is having autonomous agents playing roles in our DAOs. It could end up being a major element of DAOs. If for the first time we have organizations that are partly or completely AI driven.
Yeah. I think it could be a lot of fun. I mean, this is why I think that the future of work is actually the future of play. When I'm in that abundance mentality, that global talent marketplace that has high liquidity for opportunity to participate in, and the right value exchange to meet my needs personally, if that is possible, that in itself is the best setup for the future of work not to be work anymore. It actually is play. I get to play with my friends all over the world, building neat stuff that feels like it has value and impact, and to do it along with and play with intelligences that frankly will stretch our own.
Yeah, that's awesome. All right. Well, that's going to be it for today's episode. BPetes, if you want to share any closing thoughts you didn't have a chance to get to, and then let us know where we can find you and your projects on the web or on social.
Yeah, I think I've shared a lot and feel full. And I think you can find me, if any of these topics or solutions that we've been building at Sobol and Tipster are interesting. I'm BPetes.eth or BPetes on pretty much every social platform that you'll find crypto folks congregating on, and I'd love to chat.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And for those looking for MyDAO or for me, you can find me on Farcaster at The Thriller or Twitter/X. I'm 0xThriller. MyDAO is MIDAO.org, stands for Marshall Islands DAO, or MyDAO DS for directory services.eth, or on Twitter. And please consider liking or leaving a review of the show wherever you are listening. Obviously, would appreciate if anyone wants to subscribe. And just another quick ad for MyDAO before we close. We do legal entities for DAOs. We have a network of lawyers and service providers all over the world who are focused on DAOs and Web3. Happy to get anyone connected with them, or if you yourself are a lawyer or professional service provider, please reach out about being added to our network at no cost. Again, BPetes, thank you so much for coming on the show. Really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having me, Adam. I had a lot of fun.
You got it. Quick disclaimer, none of this is ever legal or tax advice. And finally, for the audience, are you thinking about starting a DAO? Just DAO it.